The first library we're going to be using is called Rechart. And Rechart, if you look in GitHub, it's the most popular library that I found. It has 16.4 thousand people that started, and it has 1.2 1,200 people that forked it. So that makes it really the most popular one. It does have 168 issues open. They do have, if you look at rechart.org, they have a great website with a guide that shows you how to get started. It has the API, and it kind of gives you a lot of examples how to work with a lot of the charts that they have. If you look at the table that I created that compare all of them, you could see that Rechart has, it's the most popular one, so it has a thumb up for me. At the same time, it has the most cost out of all of them. The library is not built as a module, so you need to import the entire almost 500 kilobyte just to use a simple line chart. It does support TypeScript. It doesn't have mock data built into it. It's simple to use. It's not styled, so you're going to have to style it yourself with creating renders and all kind of stuff. The documents are great. The examples are great. A lot of contributors, a lot of popularity, but also a lot of open issues. So the first chart we're going to be building is we're going to build a line chart. And if I refresh it, you can see it just draw itself slowly. You can hover over the chart and the dot align to the line, and it gives you the value. Then we're going to build some rendering, custom rendering into the chart. So I'll show you a little bit how to customize it. So it's a great library. The cost is really high if all that you want to do is create a line chart, but it's good to know and it's good to experiment with. And there's a situation that if you need a lot of charts, it's a really good library to use. We need to install a few libraries to get started. The first thing is we're going to need D3, so install D3 and D3 types, and also install Recharts and types Recharts for the types. So install those libraries, then open up app.sas file, and let's change the background from that blue grayish color to white. For the data, we're gonna, if you look at the public data, the data files we added, we're gonna use the line CSV that include some date and data, and we're gonna do it using Recoil that we learned in a previous section of this course. So in source, go to Recoil, go to selector. We can just use a selector. We don't need an atom. So we can call it line data selectors.ts. And what we can do is we can create our function component. We can call it get line data, and that will be assigned to a selector, a React selector, and inside we need to set our key. So the key, I'll just use the same name, just capital letter, first letter, the standard for Recoil. And for the get, we're just going to return a method that we're going to create to load the data. We can call it get data. And now to set get data, I'm going to create a constant. Let's call it get data, and I'll be use D3 to create a promise. I'll use D3 to load the data. So we need to create a promise, and the promise needs the resolve method to return it. And inside of our promise, hold on, we got an error. Let's see why. A return. And we don't need the return. that closes there. Okay, now inside of the promise, I'm just going to use D3. So D3, we're going to need to import that, and then we're going to use the DSV. We used this before. We need the delimiter, and we need the file we're going to be using. So it's going to be, the file name was data/line.csv. Okay, and we need to, if it doesn't import D3 automatic, it doesn't, then we need to import everything as D3 from D3. Okay, then when the data get returned, we can process it. So we can create an inline method, to process the data. And what we can do is we can create a constant, and let's call it res for results. And then we can take d, and then we can cast it as type date, which is going to be a string, and data, which is going to be a string. With some space. And then we can create the value, so we can process our data right here in our selector. So we can do a parse float, and then we can process the data as a string. So this will give us a number type, and then for the date, we can just pull it out of the result, and then we can return an object that is made out of date and value, and this will map to the value, which will be a number, and the date, which will just map to the results. And once that's done, we can create a then method, and then just pass the data and resolve the data. Let's see, data, not date. Okay, great. So now that we have our selector complete, we can consume the data into our component. App.tsx, and inside, under the function that we create, let's create a constant to consume the data. So we can call it data, and that will equal use recoil value, and we can pass in the get line data function we created. The component will go into the component folder, and let's create a new folder, and let's call it simple line chart.tsx. Oops, it needs to be a folder, not the file name. So simple line chart, and then the file, we'll create a file, we'll call it simple line chart.tsx TypeScript. And also we're going to create another file, let's call it types, to hold the types our component is going to be using. We'll start from the type. The type is, if you remember in the selector, we're passing the date and we're passing the value. So just do export namespace and the types, and we'll export the type data that will have the date as a string, and we'll have the value as a number. Okay, and now we can close everything we don't need. The selector we don't need. Okay, now in the simple line chart TypeScript file, we can create a function component. Let's call it simple line chart, and what we can do is we can set already props that we can use, and we can give the props the name simple line chart props, and create our interface already. Interface, and I'll leave right now with the to-do, so it's ready for us to use. Let me see here, we need fat arrow. Okay. Now we need to create a return method, and let's leave an empty tag just to return something. Okay. And now what we can do is we can, inside of our tag, we can use the line chart from Recharts. So just import the line chart, and this is from Recharts. And let's close the tag. Okay. And let's set some properties. We're going to need to set the width. So let's give it a 500. We're going to need to set a height, and let's give it a 300. We can set margins, and we can set the top to be 5, the right to be 30, left 20, and bottom 5. And you see, it's really similar to how we build our component that we had, you know, the dimension being pushed into our component. We use the helper. We can also push it through the helper, but I just want to show you really simple, and to simplify the whole thing. So this is a really minimalistic, simplistic way. We just want to see the chart. And now we need to set the data. So the data, we can pass it from our interface. So here we can create props, data, and our data is going to be the types dot data, and it should be an array. And then we can pass through the props, we can pass the data. Let's see. So we can pass our data here. It looks like I have a typo. Yeah, I didn't put the I in the props. We also need to export our function component so we can use it. And now go to app tsx, and let's get rid of everything inside of the header, and let's use our simple line chart that we created, and it needs the data, and the data we can just map it to the data from Recoil, so it's binded, and it's complaining because it doesn't know that the type comes in as unknown. So we need to cast the type. So as types, import that from our component library and pass it as the data, and that should take care of any errors. Let's see. You need to wait until it gets re-indexed. We need to, it's a object array. Okay. So this happens often, you know, when we set it up, we need to make sure that we pass it to the same style. Each one of the data is just one object, so it needs to be an array. Now let's look at localhost 3000. It looks like it's complaining that I don't have React in simple line chart. So even though it didn't create us any errors, simple line chart, we need to make sure we import React from React. And now if we go back into, oops, let's make sure there's no errors. Okay, now if we go back to port 3, that we don't have any errors, but nothing is drawing. The reason is that we need to add to our line another component. Let's take a look. Inside our line chart from Recharts, we need to add a line element. So there's an element called line, and and we can tell the type. So there's different types we can use, and this out of the box with the, you see a basic linear, so I can use, for example, monotone line, and then we need to tell the line, hey, what is the value, the metrics that you're using? So we need to use data key, that would be the metrics, which will use value, because it takes the data but it doesn't know which one we want to draw, right? And then we need to set, we can set all kind of stuff like the stroke width. So let's just set the stroke color. I'll set it to 888 4D8. That's going to give us a nice color that will go against white nicely. And then go back to localhost, and we have the line and we have dots on the line. This is the default view. So we drew a line. Now if we want to add the y-axis and the x-axis, go back, and then inside of our line chart we can add an x-axis and a y-axis. See? Of course it's not a line, we have to align it nicely, so I'm not going to get an errors from ESLint. Okay, and then in the x-axis we can set properties. For example, I can set the height. So let's give it a little bit of a height, because our labels, we're going to tilt them, if you remember from the end results. And then we also need to tell it, hey, what's going to be the metrics. So the metrics in Recharts is called data key, and our data key is going to be the date. And then for the y-axis, we can leave it empty because it knows already, since we set the date and we set the line. So take a look. Take a look. So now we have the x-axis with the year, and we have the y-axis with the value. So it knew that we're using the value. Now we do have it, but the chart doesn't look nice because the dates overlapping each other. So we need to do some formatting. We need to add some stuff. So let's take a look. We can add what Recharts called a Cartesian grid. So you see we have different grids. So if we add a Cartesian grid, we can actually create a grid around our chart. So we can set, for example, a stroke type. So if, for example, I want to use a stroke dash array, I can set it with, this is really CSS, right? If you remember, we've done a dash line before. So it's 3 pixel and then 3 pixel spaces. It's going to look like that. So this will give us a Cartesian grid. Take a look. Now we have the grid, and it's of type dash array. And if we want to add a tooltip, all we have to do is we need to add a tooltip element. It's frozen for me. I don't know what happened. Okay. Tooltip from Recharts. Okay. Now let's go back to port 3000 and refresh. Okay, you see, so now we have our tooltip that shows the value. Now the only thing left to do is really we need to customize those ticks so it looks better. To customize our y-axis and x-axis, we can create functions for that and then pass those functions to our to Recharts. So, for example, we can call it customized axis tick, and then we can create a props that it's going to pass from Recharts, and Recharts is going to pass an x, and it's going to pass a y for us, and it's going to pass a payload, and the payload will have the property that we're going to need is the value, and it's going to be of type string. Okay, and then inside of our customized access component, we can return. This is just like, I'm just creating a function component that we're going to pass on to Recharts. So we can return what we want to see. So what we can do is we can wrap it around a group type, and then we can create a custom text. So it's expecting a CSV element. So we can return a group, and we can return a text, and we can duplicate that for the y-axis. Customize y-axis, and we should call it customize x-axis, right? And it's going to be the same. So for the customize x-axis, what we're going to do is for the G, let's set a transform, and in our translate, we're going to pass on the props x and props y, because for the x-axis what we want to do is we want to rotate it, right? So the group needs to be straight. What we're going to rotate is the text element. So we'll set the transform, the translate at the top left corner, what is passing us from Rechart, and then for the text we can create custom text element, and we can set, for example, the font size, we can set it to 12. Then the X element, we want it at the X and Y at 0. We don't want to move those, but what we want to do is we can change the text anchor to the end and give it a fill. I'll use keyword space colors of black, and on the transform of the text we can rotate it in 35 degrees, and that will move it a little bit 35 degrees, and then we can all the labels can fit. And then for our content, see if we want to customize the label. For example, if we want to do formatting or whatever we want to do, we can do it here. But here I'm just going to use the payload props payload. The payload, I put it by mistake outside of the props. Okay, so it needs to be the props, the payload that's going to come, and then the value of the payload. So that's going to give me the that date string passed here. I'm just going to rotate it and giving it a little bit of a style. And the same with the customized y-axis for the transform, for the group transform. I want to do the same thing as what we did at the x-axis. The difference is for the text element, what we can do is we can just give it the same properties, just don't give it, we're not going to rotate it. So I can use a similar style, and then and also we need to pass, because this is a y-axis, we need to pass the dy location. I'll set it to 0. And for the payload, we're going to do the same. We're not going to process it. We're not going to change it. but we need to pass it. So they're very similar, the y-axis and the x-axis. The only difference is that for the x-axis, I'm rotating it 35 degrees, but we can do whatever we want. I'm just giving you an example so you know how to do it. And now we can take our customized x-axis and customize y-axis, and then we can assign it to our x and y axis. So for the x-axis, for the tick, we can just set it as our component we created. Okay. And for the tick, for the y-axis, we'll set it to the y-axis tick. React doesn't like this because I'm adding a payload. So I can just ignore this. It's not React really, it's ESLint, right? So ESLint doesn't like what we're doing here. Localhost, and you can see that our x-axis, we have our labels a little tinted so they don't overlap each other, and we have the labels in the right size so it really fits nicely on the screen. One more thing we can do is you could see that all the dots, all the values are being marked as dots, and if we want to get rid of it, we can get rid of it. Take a look. Create another function component. So let's put it here, and we can call it constant. We can call it, let's call it empty dot. So this way, if we can customize this tool, right? It's instead of dots, you can do whatever you want. But if we don't want the dot, we can just return an empty tag. That way, it won't give us any dots, and then we can just assign that to our line. So go back to the line, and you see that here we're setting those. Let's collapse this so you can see it better. We're setting those properties of stroke, all of that. So we can also set how to handle a dot. So we can tell it, hey, a dot, just use our function component empty dot. Make sure there's no errors. I'm getting one error here. See what happened? The data key. I lost the D somewhere. Okay, let's save again. Okay, let's take a look at localhost. Take a look. Now we have the line, but we don't have those dots on it. So it's a little bit of a cleaner look. So you saw it was really easy for us to kind of take those elements and just put them in there, and then create our function component and assign to that, and we have really good flexibility. The only problem is the cost. We're paying almost 500 kilobyte for a simple line chart. That's a lot. So if, again, it's a great library, it's easy to use, but the downside is the cost, that we're paying a lot of cost here for something simple that it doesn't worth it if we just need line chart. If we need other chart on the same page, absolutely it's worth it. But for one chart, it's an overkill.